Okay, we're going to move to our 5:15 agenda item, Cape Cod Water Protection Trust discussion with our representatives. Good evening, Senator Sear, Representative Whelan, and Representative Crocker. Appreciate you coming. I appreciate you making the time for us, Julian. I know that this legislation has been moving on quite quickly, but I think it's important that while I've had the opportunity to have the presentation probably a couple of times now, it changes very quickly, and I think it's important that you hear from us as one voice before this goes to possibly a vote. So,
Madam Chair, I just wanted to open up real quick, and just going to slide outside of the topic at hand and echo the comments of Tom Nicanello earlier, and for all you people that are sitting at home, the parade coming up on Saturday, it's near and dear to my heart, near and dear to our Mid-Cape community, and just going to implore everybody to please come on out, enjoy the parade. Let's show the rest of the Commonwealth that the Mid-Cape, we do it right down here. We celebrate the high holy day better than anybody else in the Commonwealth, better than South Boston, better than Holyoke, and better than Worcester. So
it'd be hard to beat Southie, but we'll try.
We'll beat Southie, trust me. We're Cape Cod. Nobody does it better than us.
Oh, that's true.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and all members of the board, and really glad that all three members of us who represent Yarmouth in the legislature are able to be here tonight. I am conscious of time, so any other topics you'd like to talk about, certainly glad to address those. But I think what we've wanted to do, and I really applaud you, Chairman Post, for really asking us to really come here and have a conversation about this. This is something that as a delegation we've been talking about in some way for about a year now, thinking about, all right, where are we going to get, how do we get some state resources to help all of our communities with wastewater? As especially those of you who've worked in government, worked with government, and especially legislatures, it's sort of hurry up and wait, and then things move really quickly. And so we're sensing that we are moving into the sort of moving quickly phase. And so what I wanted, I think what we want to do tonight is really just have a conversation with you and really answer any questions. In full disclosure, I'm not an expert on wastewater, but certainly have expertise in getting resources for our communities. And I think if you look at the cost to taxpayers, there is no bigger looming cost to property taxpayers in our communities than wastewater. We are under court action, and that I have a real concern that if we sort of have we can try to chart our own destiny here on Cape Cod, or we can potentially be forced to do something that would be much more costly. And to that question and those conversations about affordability here, which is always sort of foremost on my mind, the prospect of having a doubling or more of property taxes to pay for betterments by a court-mandated pipes and pump system all across Cape Cod is something that I think would really make it even harder for those of us who are trying to eke out a living here. So really defer to you. I'm glad to, if you want, we can walk through sort of the bill, or we can just get into questions. However you want to do it, we're yours.
I think it gets complicated because first of all, there's been several versions of different bills that have been on the table. So
yes.
I think maybe to update the board as to what's on the table now. So there's two different pieces to this. There's the actual expansion of the hotel-motel rooms tax to rentals, Airbnbs, and then what you're talking about is a separate piece of legislation that would be coupled with that is similar to the convention center model, if you will, in Boston, the extra piece that you're trying to create a additional Cape Cod fund for wastewater. So I think we're somewhat familiar with the expansion of the rooms tax. But I think specifically about that, who it applies to now, what's actually going to be voted on, and then the piece that.
Sure, we can get, and clearly you've done your homework, so thank you for reading all these various pieces of legislation. I think all of you have. I think we got two documents. One is the actual redraft of the bill. Currently, this is both Representative Peake and I filed legislation this spring. It was a very dense 17 pages. I believe your town manager, Dan Knappich, definitely sunk his teeth into it. I know Select Board member Mark Forrest did, others did as well. This draft is under 2 pages, so certainly, hopefully, something we that folks can understand. And really, I'm going to talk about the idea of the trust first, because really, the room occupancy piece is a legislative vehicle. Like, that's the train that's sort of moving through which we think we can get this done. But there's a sort of a whole host of other factors of sort of why we're there, and I'll explain that in a moment. I think, as you know, we have degraded water quality due to excess nitrogen in our embayments, excess phosphorus in our freshwater ponds and lakes. 85% of this problem is due to the 125,000 septic systems that we have across the peninsula. I think you're well familiar, and viewers at home are well familiar with a 2011 lawsuit from the Conservation Law Foundation against US EPA, saying that Cape Cod needs to clean up its water. There was a plan approved by Mass DEP, certified by Governor Baker, and approved by EPA in 2015 around how Cape Cod's going to go about remediating this. The good news through that process, the original price tag of just sort of all pipes and pumps was upwards of $8 billion. Now we're talking about a $4 billion price tag, in half, still very hefty. And so with this steep price tag in the billions, we have been trying to think, how do we come up with some sort of support from the state under the agreed 208 plan? Communities are responsible for 50% of the cost, so $2 billion. The state for a quarter of that, $1 billion, and then the feds another $1 billion. I can't comment on that area of government yet at the moment, but I think, from my job and our job really is around looking at, all right, where are we going to get $1 billion from? That is a hefty amount of money. It's really hard, near impossible, to get a direct appropriation for that, especially needing hundreds of millions of dollars over decades. And so the idea is to create a fund, a trust, that's housed within the existing clean water trust. So the Commonwealth has a state revolving loan fund, and so essentially we look to, let's not reinvent the wheel, let's not replicate something, let's not create a whole new big bureaucracy. How do we take existing state resources that we have, and how do we have a fund, if we're able to find a way to get some revenue for the state for this problem? How do you not duplicate things or replicate things? And so essentially this creates an additive fund or trust within the existing state revolving loan fund. It uses the same criteria of the state revolving loan fund, so this is something that you folks are probably well familiar with, and certainly your town administrator and town staff are really familiar with in applying for SRF. This is a numeric-based system, so very much a good governance piece, something that you folks qualify for. I will note that the collaborative efforts that you folks and Harwich and Dennis have been working on are weighted very favorably in the existing SRF and would continue to benefit. And so the idea is that if we put these monies that are generated into a Clean Water Trust Fund, have some sort of local or regional approval and oversight of these monies, that this is a way to come back to each of our towns to help finance and to get, essentially sort of more money in the pot for the state revolving loan program. We've designed this so that all sorts of interventions and infrastructure projects qualify for the fund. This is not just for pipes and pumps. The 208 plan is not just for pipes and pumps, and so this is reflective of that. Yes, traditional sewering, but also alternative methods, aquaculture, dredging. It foresees and allows funding for projects that or interventions that are not yet approved by DEP. And it also importantly includes Title V upgrades. So for parts of the community that may not need sewering or may not merit that, there's support for Title V. We do know that some communities have already invested in wastewater projects, significant wastewater projects. This is less germane for Yarmouth, but in the case of Provincetown, Chatham, Barnstable, and Falmouth, in addition to several towns on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, there's language in here that allows those towns to basically refinance their debt more favorably. The language also sets aside money for comprehensive water quality monitoring. This is really important because if we're actually not monitoring and able to sort of prove to EPA, DEP, and specifically Conservation Law Foundation that we're making progress on nitrogen levels in our embayments, that we're improving our water quality, that threat of that lawsuit sort of still looms, and so that's really important. We create a board, a management board. Every single town who is a member of this has a vote on that board, has a seat on that board, and their purview is very much around ensuring, basically determining the method for the subsidy of allocation, and also looking at equitable distribution. So looking at one concern we've heard from many communities is, sort of how do we make sure that there's equitable distribution across the region, across participating towns. Certainly that's a conversation and a whole host of policy issues, but I think this is really important. So there's a board that does that. And then I think, also importantly, if towns do not want to participate, they have an ability to opt out of the trust fund. And so this is something that if a town, I represent 20 towns across the Cape and Islands. There's 23 if you include those that were represented by Senator DiMacedo. There are some communities that don't have the significant wastewater challenges and needs that many communities have. I think of my hometown of Truro. Unlikely we will be seeing major sewer projects in Truro because we're so rural, maybe along that Beach Point area. In Aquina and Chilmark on Martha's Vineyard, Brewster, who's had a lot of conservation. So if a town, and in trying to design this tool to help our communities, if towns either under the select board, or in the case of Barnstable, the town council, feel this sort of isn't a fit for their needs, they can opt out. In my opinion, this has been designed more so to help communities like Yarmouth, so certainly would hope you folks would consider that. And so that's sort of the overview of sort of how we got here. When it comes to short-term room occupancy, this is something that I think actually all of our predecessors in our roles have advocated for. A number of the towns that I represent have actually submitted home rule petitions time and again to expand room occupancy, not just to hotels and motels, but to Airbnbs, short-term rentals. This is a real issue of fairness. Why is this gaining traction now, finally, after about a decade of this? One, really hard work on behalf of this delegation. Also, two, the real emergence of an online market and how Airbnb and other platforms are changing real estate in Boston. The North End is having a whole kind of change in how you have folks who are buying a whole brownstone, which would be 4 or 5 apartments, and turning them into basically a hotel. So the Senate has actually passed short-term room occupancy expansion twice in our budget. The governor has included a relatively modest proposal in his budget proposal last year. He included it again this year. And the Speaker of the House has indicated that he's going to be moving forward on this as well. So it's a train that's leaving our station. What this does not touch, and what I think we felt very strongly about as a delegation, all of our communities have a local option between 2 to up to 6%. I believe you folks in Yarmouth are at 6. That is a significant amount of resources for our communities, and something that we felt and that I feel that Beacon Hill shouldn't be meddling in. For the communities I represent, this expansion of room occupancy is arguably going to be one of the biggest increases in state-related aid, or it's not state aid, but basically allowing you folks to keep more of that money. So that option is still there. And as you said, Chairman Sherwin Post, the idea of a 2.75 dedicated wastewater fee. That's consistent with the financing mechanisms that's been used to finance convention centers on room occupancy in Boston, in Worcester, and Springfield. So it's a consistent way to go about that. So there's an overview. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. You know, the real spirit of this is to give the towns another tool for the state to step in and provide support. It's tried to fashion something that is regional in scope, but really allows towns to have a really big say, that doesn't create a sort of whole new bureaucracy, doesn't create an MWRA for Cape Cod. That was something I was very skeptical about and pushed back on early. So that's an overview. Tim or Will, do you want to chime in? What did I miss?
All I can offer is I know that the senator's been offering, he's put an awful lot of work into this, and I got to give credit where credit's due. I'm still kind of an open book on this. The main reason, and I discussed this with the senator, and I know that Representative Crocker discussed with the senator as well, what we need to hear is we need to hear feedback from the towns. We need to hear from the select boards, and I've joined with the senator in speaking in front of the Board of Selectmen or the Select Board in Brewster. And we've spoken to town officials in Dennis as well. And we're very interested in hearing what your feedback is, for good or for bad. And I mean, obviously, there are some things in here that are going to be very pleasing, I would assume, from your position. There are also some things here that are going to be concerns. So let's air it all out. Let's get all the information out there for you folks, and let's give you the best position to make an informed decision in whether you support or recommend amendments to the legislation as is, because the design of this ultimately, what my hope is what the end result is. This is still a work in progress. The end result has to be workable for the 4 towns in my district, or it's not going to have my support going forward. So please let us know how you think we can get there and if we can get there.
Thank you.
I really don't have a lot more to add, but I can just say that, speaking as a former town councilor in Barnstable, we've made some significant progress already in this area, but that, as the senator said, there are some possible advantages for the town of Barnstable to be able to do some refinancing with regard to this. It's something that I know the town manager is aware of. I don't know if he's had really long discussions with the board, and I know that they haven't brought it up yet in terms of having any major discussions on the council level. And I know you've talked to the town manager about it in Barnstable, but again, as what Tim says, it's something that needs to be workable for the towns of both Barnstable and Yarmouth, the 2 towns that I represent. But again, there are some advantages for Barnstable, and I think you people need to look at it, and you obviously need to have a discussion with regard to that. And I look at it from a little bit more of a 50,000-foot level. We obviously have to do something. We are under a lawsuit, and if you look at it from an economic point of view, setting aside the very important environmental part of it, but if you look at it from an economic point of view, we all need to have clean water. We live here. We need to have people come here in the summer times and in the off seasons. So we depend on having clean water. I mean, it's not just obviously not just for us to be able to use, but for the people who come here that provide the economy that drives this area. So it's something that we need to, something that you obviously need to discuss amongst yourself. Barnstable obviously will do that as well. But it's something that we are offering up, and we'll leave it at that, but it's, again, up to you people.
There are some key points in here that I think ultimately for the town to consider is that you're already at 6%, and you will realize funds that would come from the expansion of the room tax anyways. And that rooms tax, in my opinion, and I believe I'm going to speak for all 3 of us before you, that expanded rooms tax despite my objection to it, because I'm the no new taxes guy, I believe that that's going to pass and that's going to go through. So this is certainly an innovative way to find, to attach something to that rooms tax to help pay for the wastewater fees.
And that's no longer a home rule petition.
No, so it's not a home rule petition because essentially the objection from the Department of Revenue and others has been, well, if you allow Truro to do this and Yarmouth to do that, it becomes really difficult just from a implementation perspective. I also should mention, the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce has been a huge leader in this. They have been pushing for it. They've been working with us hand in glove in crafting legislation. Last month, their board voted 17 to 2, and the 2 votes were abstentions to support this. So this is very much something that we've really sought, and I've really sought to get, as broad support, on.
So Julian, was that support, I'm sorry, was that support for the expansion of the rooms tax, or was that for the additional 2.75?
It is support for a 2.75 additional fee that would fund in part a Cape Cod Water Protection Trust. I should also mention the trust is set up that, say federal dollars did become available, this is a place where those dollars could go if there were other appropriations, potentially through a bond bill. So it's designed to be a bucket that could take potential other revenue streams. But this is, specifically the vote is in support of the 2.75%.
So we've had a lot of discussion about wastewater and how we're going to address it here at our committee level. And, so one of the things is that we've tried to do is try not to burden our taxpayers, as least as possible. So I'm just going to talk for me, not on behalf of the board, but for me, wrapping my mind around the expansion of the rooms tax and supporting it, any new tax, I think, is always an issue. But, in bringing parity to the market and thinking about the facilities that we need to build for our peak seasons based on our tourism, there is a correlation to me with the tourism and the hotels and motels rooms and the flow that we need to build to accommodate that. So in my mind, that expansion, right now, the hotel and motel, that originally was a home rule petition, and we opted for it. We opted for it with a plan. So to expand it, to me, we would have a plan for that funding, and to me, that extra 6%, I would love to see to go to wastewater. I think that the closer the funds are to the town, the better they are. I mean, we can talk about how much money we send in lottery and how much we get back. So when we talk about another layer of government, it concerns me. It concerns me about making sure there's fairness in what we get back. Personally, I'd rather control my own money. I'm a little bit concerned about whether or not an analysis has been done to figure out, everybody keeps saying, the 6% that we do, people don't balk at that. But when you start adding and adding, have we done an analysis really to see what that top number is in terms of what really does make a difference when people start to make a different decision in where they're
Good question. Yep.
where they're going? I'd hate to go over that. I personally would like to see the expansion of the rooms tax, us to see what we could do with our own funds. I know you said that it's not another layer of government, but in my mind, it's another layer of government because there's going to be somebody else who's telling us how they're going to spend the money that's collected. And it's not our money; it's money from people who vacation here. But personally, I'd rather have control of it myself. I feel like, we do a good job with our money, and we have a significant amount of revenue that will be seen from this, and I think other towns will benefit from it. Now, having said that, I think that this is a problem that all of Cape Cod has to do, and one of the problems that we had before when we tried to put a plan before the town was that we were more aggressive than Dennis, for instance, and yet we're sharing the same river, so people were concerned about, what are they doing on their side? And Barnstable probably has the same thing with us, so we all are in it together. And I do think the 2-8 plan will force us to do it smarter, but I'm not sure how that will be delegated. The opt-out piece, so the 2.75% would be for all rooms.
Yep.
Not just the expansion. That would be
All rooms.
all hotel rooms. So
All
even
hotel,
our additional
motel,
hotel
Airbnb.
rooms.
Yep.
So that's.
It's a sizable chunk of money.
Yep. And the money, because it's SRF, does not go to permitting and design. So we will.
So, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So on the permitting design question, that's actually a regulatory fix we can make. I've actually spoken with DEP Commissioner Marty Suberg about this, because this is one of the challenges Barnstable's run into, that they've set aside money, but they don't, the permitting and design piece, and so that actually we're going to work, and I'm going to get this in writing from them, is that we can use some of these monies also for permitting and design. That's a challenge that we've seen, and so this addresses that.
Yeah.
Because that's a real challenge, right? If you just have, if you have $20 million for a big project, but you don't have the initial start money, you can't get there.
Yeah, so that's
yep.
just my general thoughts. I think about the lottery funds that we send and
Yeah,
we don't
no,
get back, and we really are the cash cow here
Yeah.
for the rest of it, and we have significant issues. So, if we could just keep the money that we're sending, keep the money that we have, let us deal with it ourselves, we would be in a much
Yeah.
better position. Well,
I wish that, I think speaking politically, right, I wish I could just say, and that was politically feasible for us to say, all right, let's tally up all the money that's generated here on Cape Cod in each and every single one of our towns, and we would like a check back, please, for our wastewater problem, and by the way, the other things we're facing, in a representative democracy like we have in our Massachusetts legislature. There are 8 of us who represent this region on Beacon Hill out of 2,200 members. That is just unlikely to be feasible. I think you asked a really good question about sort of the analysis on, all right, where do we get, how do we look at economic impact from, an increase in rooms tax. This is, yes, this is other people's money, but people make, consumers make decisions. And so the Cape Cod Chamber really studied this issue. And the best research that's out there, and we can share this with you, we'll get it, is that consumers, room occupancy taxes and use fee taxes of this sort, consumers about the 18% or 20% levels where you see consumers impacting things. We're not talking about that. I think we are talking about, it could be if you have the full 6%. So currently now the state collects 5.7%. The towns can go up to 6%, and then it would be a 2.75. I think there should be some conversation, within especially the towns that are at the full 6%, the phase-in of that. On that 6% number, you are likely to receive, if we actually do this, take aside this current proposal we're talking about, that 6% hopefully is coming your way, which for Yarmouth is significant. For all of the towns I represent, it is significant. So just, from unclear when the implementation and the start date of that is really important, right? Because you wouldn't want to, if we pass something tomorrow, you wouldn't want to say, all right, starting July 1st, when you have all these, people who've made arrangements, you can't levy that tax then. So the phase-in is something we're looking at as well. And when you look at so we've looked at that. And I think to the closer to the town piece, I think is something that I agree with. I think that we politically, we would also not be able to, if we just said, all right, we want to levy a 2.75%, but it comes back to each of our individual towns, effectively that's like an expansion that's basically giving certain communities more of a local option than others, and would be unlikely to fly. The convention center, basically using a 2.75% occupancy additional fee to solve a regional problem. Traditionally, in the case of convention centers, it's economic development, but in this case, it would be wastewater, is something that our colleagues on Beacon Hill can relate to, and it sort of made sense. So we've talked a little bit about, well, hey, could we just get an additional amount that would come back to each of the towns?
you give us part of the 5%.
Point well taken. Unfortunately, I think not sure if we'll prevail there. But so I think trying to figure out, all right, how do you get resources from the state within the existing world that we're living in, which is challenging.
I understand.
But I'll make sure to get you the chamber study on that, because that's really important.
I think we received it, or I received it. I'm not sure if Dan sent it to the
No,
board.
that was the rate, or number room
dollar
analysis.
amount.
Yeah, this is something that we had seen last year that I thought, to your point, to the senator's point, was pretty fascinating about when people start changing their buying patterns. Yeah.
Huh. So this would need to go before town meeting? No piece of it?
If the town would opt out, it would go before town
And
meeting.
opting out means that they wouldn't collect it, or we just wouldn't be part of
If you opt
giving it
out, a 2.75% is not collected and you are not part of the fund. There's actually language that allows towns to opt into the fund at a later date if they want. And there's also language that allows towns to get out. If you've already received money, you've got to kind of figure out that accounting of it. And there's language in here as well that gives some time. We're talking about like a 2020 timeline. So it gives towns the time to really look at this and study this and to really run some numbers. Because we actually don't know on the expansion room occupancy, we don't have hard numbers on what it's going to mean when we can get these numbers from Airbnb, but it's real estimates when it comes to the rentals.
Well, I can tell you a little bit of history. I see Karen Green sitting there. We've struggled in our community for many years dealing with the long-term rentals and hotels. And I can tell you that the state was not very helpful with us in trying to figure out who was paying the rooms tax and who wasn't. So, you have a whole nother issue of enforcement. And when you're trying to bring fairness by leveling the playing field, so to say, and some are paying and some aren't, and there's nothing we can do about it. The state doesn't work with us in terms of telling us who that has a hotel license pays rooms tax and who doesn't. And we really should be a better partner in that, because if we could help you and you could help us, it would definitely be a better process. So,
Madam Chair, with the town meeting piece, just to be sure, as I'm looking and reading in this draft, looks like it, just to make sure that you guys are clear, according to this draft, it's a 2/3 vote to withdraw. So if you don't assemble the 2/3, then the town automatically becomes a member of the Water Protection Fund.
right, which is a problem because our warrant's set and closed. So.
This likely would not. We're not talking about town meeting this spring. We're not talking about town meeting this fall. We're talking, about next year, the year after.
Okay.
Unlikely this will be finally passed by your town meeting, so we're not.
Great.
Want to be clear on that.
All right, we'll start with Mark.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. I think, as you stated in the beginning, this is not only a major issue for Cape Towns, it's also been actually a challenge for the Cape delegation. And that is to figure out ways creatively to come up with the resources that are needed at the state level to help local communities really address this problem. I think my observation, I'm just speaking for myself, is that I think this was one of the difficulties that we faced several years ago when Yarmouth was sort of tackling this issue by itself. That the lack of state funding, the lack of federal funding, I think I think many people in the community felt the burden was really falling squarely on them. So the fact that you collectively have stepped up and worked on figuring out some creative ways to address this challenge is, I think, something that you should all be commended for. So I appreciate very much the work that you've done. I also appreciate the fact that you've been listening to various groups, various organizations. You've certainly gotten an earful from me on numerous occasions, and I appreciate the fact that you've been listening and listening hard and also making some adjustments as you move along. So I think this kind of conversation with the board is very timely, it's very helpful, and I think it's terrific that you're here to listen to our board and some of the other comments and thoughts that they might have about this. The only other thing that I would want to mention is the fact that I like the fact that there's some openness that towns that are trying to be creative. I see Andy Gottlieb here from Mashpee. Mashpee's done a remarkable job in finding creative ways to address the problem of nutrient loading by going into an aquaculture direction, looking at shellfish propagation. And the fact that this is an initiative that allows towns to be creative. The problem that we've had in the past is that so many of our approaches traditionally have been sort of stovepipe, cookie cutter, it's sewering or nothing. And the fact that we can try to be creative by looking at permeable reactive walls, to be looking at shellfish, to enable financing to cover those ranges of options, I think is incredibly important. And as you know, you've heard from some other communities that are dealing with water issues, but they aren't necessarily exactly in line with what we're dealing with here. But clearly, I think what you've done is remarkable. I appreciate the dialogue and your effort to reach out and get additional comments. And like I said, in terms of my specific comments about the bill, you've heard plenty from me. I'm more than happy to yield the rest of my time to the rest of the board.
And we've made revisions, as you'll notice. So, and following tonight, actually, we'll make more revisions to this too. So
Can't say enough that this is absolutely a work in progress, and the senator's been great. As I mentioned earlier, we've been on kind of the listening tour, touring around, listening to folks in my part of the legislative district as well. But we want to hear your feedback, and this is not by any means the finished product that you see before you today. We have to find out what works best for you, what works best for the other towns, and then eventually, hopefully, we'll get there and get this to a point where the vast majority, if not all the towns in the Cape, find it acceptable and useful.
Mike?
I think on the positive side, the flexibility that the proposed legislation has in terms of allowing for innovative and alternative technologies is a good thing. Shellfish propagation as an alternative in areas that aren't as heavily impacted as some others that would require sewering is a good thing. And I suppose it's noteworthy, too, that towns that have already taken the initiative have a vehicle for relief in terms of refinancing debt for the good work that they have already done. Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense to approach wastewater on a regional basis because these water bodies are a common resource to the Cape in general and also among towns. For example, we share Lewis Bay with Barnstable, and we share Bass River with Dennis, and so to take a watershed approach, I think, is a good thing and makes a lot of sense. The concern I have is an implementation of the equitable portions of this agreement. Norman and I know what equity means. Our problem is people that we deal with on the other side of the river sometimes have different notions of what that means. And that's the difficult part of this legislation is that, if I understand it correctly, each town is going to get one member, one representative to this body that oversees the distribution of these funds. It's not going to be weighted voting, as I understand. Like, for example, the Barnstable County government, the Assembly of Delegates, you have weighted voting. Well, a town like Yarmouth has a lot of rental units, a lot more than probably most towns on the Cape. And yet, other towns with very little revenue generating capacity are going to have the same voice. And I think that's, in terms of the implementation of this, I think it's going to create some problems. Again, I'd have to study it more carefully to give a final recommendation on that, but my gut instincts tell me that weighting voting would be fairer than one vote for one town, because I think the major stakeholders should have the major voice in the allocation and the distribution of these funds. There's an old saying about the tyranny of the minority, and I think sometimes that's more than just a cliche. I think that could very well be at work here in terms of the implementation of this plan. in terms of the opt-out provisions, I think you have, if you opt out, you have a hiatus that you have to serve like 2 years, isn't it, before you
Correct.
can
Yep.
come back in? And during that 2 years, your town's not collecting any monies because you have already opted out, right? So there's no penalty there. It's just that
No
you have to
penalty.
wait to 2 years
Yep.
before you can get back in. And at that time, the tax would kick in.
Correct.
Is that how it's going to work?
Yes, correct.
So, again, it's the same thing with education. It's the same thing with regional wastewater approach. All those things make sense. I mean, the Cape's really a small area, and it has a very fragile environment. It's aesthetic appeal. It's oceans. It's rivers, lakes. It's really the bedrock of the economy as well as the quality of life here. And so, obviously, there has to be a solution. It's going to be, hopefully, the federal government will buy in for a piece, and the state will buy in for a piece, because I don't think the people on Cape Cod can afford $4 billion.
No, they can't.
It won't get done.
Yeah.
If they want us to pay $4 billion to resolve this problem, I'm going to open a musket shop, because there'll be another revolution. We do not have those kind of resources on the Cape. But again, the devil's in the details. And I see on an administrative level a difficult system to administer without weighted voting.
Thank you. So on the equitable distribution piece, we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And actually, in a prior iteration of the draft, it basically, there was language that said, each town will get back at least however much money they put in. And that's been ruled by legal counsel to have some problems around that, and so we couldn't keep that in. But that was sort of in the original legislation. It's really interesting when you look at when you look at both needs of what are going to be needed project-wise, but then also looking at sort of where this money is going to be generated. Probably, actually the town that actually probably generates some of the most room revenue and will under expansion is actually Provincetown, which has a huge rental market, very, very valuable. And so the sort of traditional ways that we've weighted voting on the Cape Basin population, which is a constitutional requirement, it's a tough fit. I think for Yarmouth, you folks both have, you're one of the higher generators currently of room occupancy. I think you'll continue to see that with the expansion. But you're also among the towns that have some of the more significant need, and so hopefully that's a fit. We have tried, and I'm certainly open to suggestions on this. If you look in, it's section 3, which talks about the management board and why we had a management board. If you look at SRF implementation, and I don't know if the town administrator or other staff wants to talk about this, my understanding is that the SRF process is there's a process and there's a scoring system, but as far as sort of government bureaucracy, it's not as cumbersome as other initiatives. You were talking about SBA funding, the school funding rather earlier. That is a far more involved sort of process. And so what's envisioned here, right, is just to sort of layer on, and I envision, an additional page or two, right, with criteria for this additive funding. That's what it's really intended to be. Now, you could imagine that would just be administered, by the State Revolving Loan Fund out of Boston, and it's a scoring system, and you get your money. We heard a lot of feedback around wanting to have some sort of local control of this. So the management board is sort of an attempt to make sure that you have local input. It's actually town managers are the folks who serve on that. There's some technical assistance that are provided from others, but basically their main duty is to look at equitable distribution among participating municipalities consistent with revenue deposited from each municipality into the fund, and to ensure that monies from the fund are spent only for the purposes listed in the sections above. We can work to strengthen that, and if you have thoughts on how we do it, unfortunately, the sort of dollar in, dollar out piece just doesn't pass. It doesn't work legally, unfortunately. And so I don't know, from a weighted vote perspective, I don't know if we could say, I don't know, I'd have to take that back to council and say, well, can you weight votes based on where the money comes in from? You might want to be cautious about that, because especially when you add in the expansion of these room rent, of actual rentals of homes. So Truro, right, tiny little town. I think we got 0.97% of a vote in the county. My hometown where I live, 2,007 people, I think. Truro has multiple homes that rent for over $30,000 a week. So if you had a weighted voting, and you could look at it, but it might be interesting sort of who emerges with having the biggest vote in a weighted voting system that was based on money that came in. So we can look at that, but I think my understanding of, because you're bringing in these additional rentals and because you're talking about such huge generation that's going to come from large properties that are rented out, and Yarmouth has properties that rent for a lot of money too. But I've had some caution in looking at, all right, if we do a weighted vote, it may be that some of the smaller communities with very little need would have a much bigger say than others.
You could also have some minimums based on number of rental units in a given locality. That they would be assured a certain minimum percentage of the funds. I mean, there's got to be some kind of a minimum ratable distribution formula that could be implemented.
Yeah, and you know what? We'll try to keep at that, because that's something that's been, continually been a challenge.
I have a suggestion on that, because I think, next.
Are you finished?
I guess you are.
Thank you.
We know we got about a $4 billion commitment, big number. That, when you get into the details of that, it's so many gallons of effluent that have to be handled. I don't know why we can't approach this, the allocation of funds, just like you would with the development of a sewer system. Have an allocation of gallons of potential capacity to all the towns on the Cape. And if a town does not use their allocation, they could sell that to another town. And that might resolve the situation with Truro, for example, allow them to sell some of their gallons to a neighboring community or to any other community on the Cape. They essentially would be getting some credit back, and the details of how that would work out would need to be worked through. But that concept is consistent with the way many overall sewer authorities work. And I saw that work in Vermont, in Killington, and you had a big system, and let's say it could handle 100,000 gallons, just for a number.
Yep.
And then gallons were allocated out to each property in the community, and then certain properties that didn't use those could allocate those back to other properties, or sell those rights to other properties. So that might be a method that could be used. But I think that some method of allocation of capacity on a system, quote-unquote, Cape-wide system basis needs to be done in order to assure the equity that Mike was talking about. Whether you deal with that on a voting basis or whether you assign the gallons out, I think that accomplishes the same thing in a little bit different way.
Interesting.
It distributes the capacity equitably across the entire Cape. But I have another big picture question on this. We've got a $4 billion requirement. How much is this going to generate? Is this going to generate 50% of the bonding requirement for a $4 billion investment? Or, because we need to know that. If we can only go to the fund for, let's say we've got a $250 million requirement here in our community. If we can only expect to get $150 million from the fund, we need to find a source for the other $100 million. So we need to know what the capacity is of this plan, and I don't know if you have the answer to that right offhand or not.
So from the back of the napkin estimates we've done, because again, there's no hard numbers out there on what the expansion of room occupancy is going to look like from a rental perspective. Those are guesstimates. This is for the $1 billion. Conservatively, the state's on the hook for, or has committed in the 208 plan, signed off by the governor, signed off by DP, for $1 billion of the $4 billion problem. So that this, the aim is to generate, approximately a little under 20 million over that. We're talking over like a 30, 40 year period. So over many decades.
Annually, you mean?
Annually, yes.
20 million annually?
Yep.
Okay. I'm looking at thinking about the debt service on
Yep.
250 million of about 20 million annually. Time you add back interest, it usually doubles the amount of the obligation over 25 years, just round numbers, $20 million a year. We don't build that out, but so you're saying for the entire Cape, 20 million a year?
So yes, and this is not my, this is not our sort of expertise, is in sort of estimating this, and we've asked that this be looked at, and we're trying to get better numbers. I actually had my district director reach out to Airbnb and say, all right, hey, can we just get a sense of how many rooms you've got on Cape Cod, on the islands? The other factor in this is that the islands are in this. This is something that I've pushed for because I represent these communities as well, and they have these same wastewater challenges that we do. They're just under a court order. And oh, by the way, if they're in this, you're talking about, again, significantly more money that's going into this. So let me follow up with the folks at the Chamber and others that we've been working on to get you harder numbers on this. This has been a critique that I've had and that others had, is saying, like, all right, look, we need to really get our handle around what this is. This is designed, though. This is not designed to solve the whole problem. This is about the state's portion of solving the problem. So this still leaves the town of Yarmouth and every other town, with at least 50% of that cost. So it's meant to be additive. It's meant to be additional to the SRF. It's not designed to solve all those problems. I think the estimates that I've seen have been conservative, and I think that my sense is that expanded room occupancy is just so significant, right? We've seen such a move to rentals that hopefully this will, I think we're talking about these as serious dollars, but we'll follow up with those more specific numbers, because I've been wanting those too.
Okay. I think that's really important.
Yep.
I guess the point that Tracy was making about the other 6%, I have a philosophical issue with trying to hold the current residents responsible financially for a problem that's been generated over 3 or 4 generations. And that just doesn't, and I can't imagine how anybody
We
could
won't talk
logic.
about OPEB right now.
No, we're not talking about OPEB.
No,
We're not talking about OPEB. That's
Put it all on the table.
Oh, you want to get started? That's
Which is funny, as soon as you said that, Eric and I looked at each other and we're like,
So his head go like this. Oh, God, no.
yeah, really. But other solutions, and we've got to have fairly quick solutions
Yep.
that do not place burdens from a property tax perspective.
Absolutely.
You know, Cape Cod is, if you look at the economics of the Cape, the average household incomes are a fraction of what they are statewide. And we simply don't have the capacity to go after residents like some of the communities outside of Boston might, or in other areas. So it's just not, and one of the reasons we get so much pushback is for that very reason. Where's the money going to come from?
Yep.
No, you're absolutely right. We don't want to be driving seniors out of their homes, and that's exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
If we attack it through property taxes. Selectman Holcomb, you're 100% correct.
So, so there has to be some additional effort, and we've worked on the issue. We have some things that we think we can do, but it'll need state approval, legislative action, and so forth. But you know, it's still a major issue. So, but we do need some answers in terms of what we can expect in terms of funding. The other issue that I would bring up is communities like Yarmouth, Dennis, Harwich, working in partnerships. Well, the projection is that there might be, in total, I think the numbers are right around $50 million in savings. Well, how does that get factored in? Because what's the incentive to our communities to work together if that money's just, you know, there's no credit for having done that sort of work? So I think something has to be done in that regard to give some recognition to regional approaches that save a significant amount of money.
Selectman Holcomb, my understanding is under the existing SRF criteria, you receive significant points for that, for regional partnerships, and I think that that's something that this is intended to extend. But I'll ask too. I'm not an expert in SRF approval.
Okay.
But it's a good question.
I guess my other question at this point is with regard to this revolving fund. This is bonding, this revolving fund that is done by the state and is made available on a quote-unquote as-needed basis, or how does that work? And
Correct. It's a rolling fund as a as-needed basis. Municipalities apply, and it's scored. It's a scored system, so there's no undue influence with it. It's administered by the treasurer with consultation from Mass DEP.
so how do the interest rates work?
They're very low interest rates. I think they're a lower
qualify
interest
for
rate.
0%?
I think they're almost. I think it's 0% nearly.
So there's in fact some subsidy
Yes.
built into that effectively. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay.
Can I ask one more question before you go there?
Okay.
In terms of the integrity of this fund, what assurance do the residents have that this fund won't be repurposed or invaded or used for some other, I mean, some funds in the past in the government have been misappropriated.
No.
Never
One
heard that.
example that comes to mind is Social Security. How solid is this in terms of this money basically being sequestered and used for these purposes and only for these purposes going forward?
That's a great question. So one thing we spent a lot of time thinking about is that we have a penchant in the legislature broadly of putting aside money and then for a dedicated purpose and then sticking our hands in it when we need that money. This is designed in linking this with the State Revolving Loan Fund program, which is a program that the legislature has not dipped their hands into to touch. We think that yet, but we think it's pretty tough. Also, by putting this in statute, you have to go through. You'd have to go through the legislature to get that done. And if you look at the composition and how we work as a delegation, you would need basically unanimous support from the Cape and Islands delegation to make any of those changes. And you'd also need leaders on Beacon Hill to basically view it as sort of not controversial, basically almost like a regional home rule. So it's very hard to sort of repurpose this stuff. I will say that the original proposal that was brought to me, which I immediately rejected, was far more expansive. It talked about having a regional infrastructure bank, which would have been, in my opinion, was sort of not appropriate for the need, and could have been repurposed in many different ways. This is very narrow, very specific, relatively lean, uses existing criteria, doesn't build a whole new bureaucracy, and as far as the sticky fingers problem, it's as airtight as you can get.
Sticky finger problem. I like it.
Hopefully. I mean, there's always we have a bad habit in the legislature, but we've designed it to be as airtight as possible.
Norm, you finished? All set?
I'll be happy to go on about OPEB, but that's...
Eric?
Just a couple of quick things to make sure I understand correctly. I've heard both 6% and 2.75%. I'm not sure I'm clear on the difference. 2.75 is the adder to the 6.25 we already have.
So there's three. That's a good question. There's actually three numbers that we're talking about. The state, regardless if you have no local option or a local option, collects 5.7%. That goes to the Department of Revenue. Towns currently under existing law have authority to have a local option at 2%, at 4%, at 6%. You folks have voted to be at 6%. That money is also collected by the Department of Revenue and then comes back quarterly as a check to the town of Yarmouth. We're talking about an additional 2.75% on top of that 5.7, on top of the, in this case, 6, and a 2.75 collected in the same mechanism, but that sort of check or money exchange, if you will, would go into this fund.
All right. My second question is, I just want to make sure I'm clear. You know, you put it, Senator Sear, as $1 earned or $1 put in doesn't necessarily get you $1 out. So the revenues that the town of Yarmouth generates from this are going to be put into a $1 billion pot somewhere. So, you know, for instance, if Yarmouth contributed 65% and another community contributed 35%, the other community would benefit from Yarmouth's 65%. Well, I just, you know, we already have one of those deals.
Yeah, no.
Thank you very much.
This has not been modeled after the regional school agreement between the tenants in Yarmouth.
It's similar.
Very cynical.
It's similar. Other towns are going to benefit from our size and our revenue and our ability to generate revenues.
From as someone who is a resident of a small town, which I will not say this in, actually I did say this in Truro, and I said this for the select board, from a sending town into this, I actually think Yarmouth is one of the, from my perspective, I think Yarmouth is one of the communities that will benefit most or more. I think sending communities, I look at a town like Provincetown, which is going to need to build out their, a little more of their sewering, but they've already kind of invested in those projects. Look at a town like Chatham, which has basically built out their project. I look at Truro, which is going to have a very sort of minor need. These are communities that are going to put in significant dollars, which, given as well, I think the real tremendous effort and movement we've seen between Harwich, Dennis, and Yarmouth on this partnership, I think you folks are going to be well positioned to get some of these dollars. You know, if you look at where our communities in wastewater plan, like, you know, who's ready to seize on additional resources, resources for wastewater? I think Orleans is in a good position. I think now with this tri-town approach, I think you folks are in that position. And I think Mashpee has some, you know, the aquaculture projects that have been talked about. So, and actually in Truro, when I presented this before the Board of Selectmen, you know, I think there was acknowledgement in Truro that, look, you know, our community doesn't exist, right? You know, 30 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean, if you don't have Hyannis and you don't have Yarmouthport and you don't have an Orleans, right? And that you need to have these more vibrant commercial centers where if you're someone like me, you know, this is where you do a lot of your commerce and shopping and where you go to the hospital and a whole host of things. So I think from what I said earlier is that unfortunately from a legal perspective, we couldn't, by saying $1 in, $1 out, in law, it's almost like it's problematic. And so that's what I was saying. Unfortunately, we can't say that. And so what we're trying to do, and Selectman Hope, I'm going to take a look at, your suggestion on that, is what we're trying to do is basically say, all right, this has to be equitably distributed, considering in where revenues are generated, without basically putting ourselves in a situation where we're saying something that's not going to pass council and is not legal. Does that make sense?
We're not going to get our money back.
And I should also add, too, this is designed to give towns several years to actually look at this, right? So we can actually see what the revenues are, that you can actually make kind of an educated decision, really look at what these numbers are, because I think we don't know, or we have educated guesstimates, but when you're talking about this additional room occupancy, it's still to be seen in a certain sense.
And my last question is, I haven't had the opportunity to formulate this thought clearly in my own head, but in terms of the issue of opting out, I'm inclined to be opposed to that, and the reason is, I remember when we were trying to sell a sewer system here in Yarmouth, for argument's sake, let's say the southern half of Yarmouth was going to have to be hooked up and the northern half of Yarmouth wasn't. Well, everybody was going to have to pay for it to some extent. And the argument was that everybody benefits from clean water. Everybody benefits from the environment. So I think that, to allow towns to opt out and then reap the benefit of a healthier environment and clean water is kind of counterintuitive to me. So I don't know that I would give towns the opportunity to opt out, because the health of the environment is good for us all. So, and that was, it was unsuccessful here, but
Yeah.
It's a good argument.
Yep. No, and actually, that's an argument that we've actually had internally as a delegation. One argument saying, all right, this is a major problem. The state's on the hook for $1 billion of it. Here's how we're going to do it. Everyone's in, and you don't get to say, if you're a town, let's use the example of towns like Sandwich, Brewster, Truro, who aren't going to have sewers, but who are contributing to, water quality in embayments in other towns. No, we're all in this together. On the other hand, hearing from, a community like Provincetown, which sort of sees this and is, some members some folks have seen this in the town and said, well, wait a minute, we've already taken care of our problem. Why should we be helping, any other community but ourselves? They neglect, as we remind them in Truro, that they get their water from Truro, and they wouldn't have water without Truro. But, so the opt-out provision was actually really a compromise between the delegation and saying, all right, towns have a choice, but an opt-out from a 2/3 vote at town meeting is a high bar, so that basically there's an ability for towns to opt out, but there's going to have to be a real cogent argument and a conversation with the voters to do that. And so that's sort of the compromise that we struck, because I think there was a real sentiment. I think of our colleague Randy Hunt, who I think is, has talked really about, all right, wanting everyone to be in this, and then the challenges we've had from, that Representative Peake has with some of her communities, especially Chatham and Provincetown, that have made those investments. So that's sort of how that opt-out was designed. There's an opt-out, but it's it's a heavier lift than, say, well, the Board of Selectmen can just vote to opt out. Thank you for your comments.
Understood. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. That's all.
Thank you. So I appreciate it. Obviously, you've spent so much time on this. It's come a long way. I've watched the progress, the many years of legislation. In Yarmouth, 3 times we had different legislation that passed town meeting but didn't get enacted in the state for the expansion. So to me, that tells me where I think the people of the town feel with the expansion. So personally, I'm in favor of that. Again, I want to keep my money, and I think we would use it wisely, but I'm still somewhat concerned about another layer and how that whole thing works. One of the things I did talk to you about some time back was some of the ideas that we talked about here in Yarmouth on how we were going to address wastewater. And one of them was the possibility of asking our delegation to look at the CPA enactment and allowing to broaden that so that each town could, if they wanted to, use it for wastewater. Some towns obviously will continue to use it for historic and recreation, and I think those are great options. But if it can be expanded to include wastewater, because wastewater is certainly something that has to do with recreation and historic and all the things that we love
Preservation,
here
yeah.
about Cape Cod. I know that there was some talk about the act, the Community Preservation Act, even being continued after 2020 or where we're at with that. But if there's an opportunity to start to look at that as another funding stream for communities, not just on Cape Cod, but throughout the Commonwealth that would like to utilize that, I think it fits nicely into that. One of the other pieces also that we talked about was a conveyance in the Registry of Deeds. All things that would, help us, but not put the burden really on taxpayers. So those were, I think, two of the pieces that at some point in time we wanted to talk to you about. I think it all goes together because, you're talking about your state piece, but in terms of us as a town, how we're going to fund it, we need to continue to look at options.
Thank you, and by no means, if this is enacted and passed and signed into law, that this is no means sort of the end of that work, right? There's so much more to be done. I think we are going to have an opportunity to look at CPA. There's actually a zoning reform and housing production bill that's being worked through the legislature. There's actually some talk at actually looking at CPA as it relates to housing and some issues. That may be a space to look at the wastewater component of that. I don't know, but I think I'll look at that. And I think, however, I can and we can, I think, help you folks, find creative solutions around how we're going to address these challenges, particularly just not relying on the backs of property taxpayers because, really, if you look at the needs that we have, that's just, I'm concerned about that from an equity perspective, and I'm concerned about that from the sustainability and preservation of our community. We're already, unable to continue. We're already really
regional
struggling.
Transportation that doesn't get funded, so we need that money.
Thank you.
Community preservation fund.
Yeah. No, we're very cynical. It happens. No, but I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you listening to the board. I think it's really important. Does anybody else have anything else?
I would just like to thank them for their hard work and their time tonight to come in and talk to us and to the folks out there. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.